According to UN Women, globally, an estimated 736 million women, so that's almost 1 in 3, have been subjected to intimate partner violence, non-partner sexual violence, or both, at least once in their life. So 30% of women aged 15 and older. This figure doesn't include sexual harassment and only reported cases, obviously. So the shadow figure is much higher. Naturally, the rates of depression, anxiety disorders, unplanned pregnancies, transmitted infections, HIV are a lot higher in women who have experienced violence compared to women who have not, as well as many other health problems that can last even after the violence has ended. Furthermore, in some countries, calls to helplines have increased fivefold since the start of the pandemic. So, 1 in 3 women worldwide has or will experience violence in her lifetime, based purely on the fact that she's a woman. It's important for me to be speaking about this today because violence against women is really a worldwide problem, and it's everyone's problem. It exists in virtually every culture on Earth. Hi, I'm Cecilia, and today I'll talk about how to go from the hashtag #NotAllMen to supporting diversity, inclusion, and equity. Topics around diversity and inclusion have flamed up again in the last years, thanks to great work of different movements. In many conversations around these issues, white cisgender men can sometimes feel sidelined. So in this talk, I'd like to include them and explain white patriarchy, why the hashtag #NotAllMen is problematic, and what everyone can do instead to support a diverse, just, and equal society. To understand white patriarchy, let's break it up and look at the individual terms, starting with patriarchy. Merriam-Webster defines patriarchy as the social organization marked by the supremacy of the father in the clan or the family, the legal dependence of wives and children, and the reckoning of descent and inheritance in the male line. Broadly speaking, it's the control by men of a disproportionately large share of power. Most societies are governed by patriarchy. There are some matriarchies where succession and power run through the female line. However, those are rare and few to come by. Importantly, this is a societal construct, meaning it's not natural, something we've all been born with, and it's not one single person acting in a way. It's about an entire institution that affects our way of thinking, our culture, our tradition, our actions. A real example of patriarchy that you can find then in traditions are, for instance, Western wedding customs, like the father walking the daughter down the aisle, giving her away, essentially handing over property of his to a new man. I know a lot of people do argue it's just a nice custom nowadays, but essentially, by negating the tradition and the thought behind that, all those horrible connotations and the history, they don't actually go away. And it's not been that long ago that the father had sole say over who the daughter actually had to marry. And in a lot of cases, it still is. So by going through these actions, even though we don't actually believe in the tradition behind them, we still reaffirm them and we don't actually break with them. Another example is that historically, since everything depended on the male line, women were second-class citizens. So while the emphasis was put on educating the son so he could improve the family legacy or improve the family situation, women were not pushed to strive for self-improvement, aside for making them more eligible for the marriage market. And while this has improved in the last century for women in selected Western countries, it's still a far cry from reality for many girls across the globe. And that's why it's really important that great work is being done by charities and grassroots projects to help with this. So now let's add the element of race onto this concept. Simply put, this means that not only are men the ones in power positions, but more specifically, white men. Where does this socio-cultural concept come from, you might ask? Well, white patriarchy is a Western cultural power construct, and it comes from white hegemonic thinking. And this thinking was born in Western Europe, and it basically ran alongside colonialism. It was perpetuated by intellectuals to justify colonialization, enslavement, and oppression. The theory took shape and really firmed up through quite lots of seminal works, such as Darwin's theory of evolution or Galton's theory of genius, or one of history's greatest philosophers, Immanuel Kant, who was blatantly sexist and racist when he argued that white men are naturally superior to women and other ethnicities. He formulated egalitarian moral principles, and yet he defended colonialism and enslavement. So as we can see, this ideology was nothing new and was really dominant in sciences as well. On a side note here, I use Western to denote the cultural West. I always like talking about Edward Said, who was a brilliant cultural theorist, and one of his seminal works is called Orientalism, where he defines the concept of otherness between the Orient and the Occident. And he argued that the relationship between the Occident and the Orient is a relationship of power, of domination, of varying degrees of a complex hegemony, and that as much as the West itself, the Orient is an idea that has a history and a tradition of thought, imagery, and vocabulary that have given it reality and presence in and for the West. So to break this down, history, culture, they're all not natural things, but they've only become real through humans, more specifically, humans in power. And by creating that other, as he terms it, the West has had a counterpart that it could set itself off against. And this otherness was used time and again in history to justify all kinds of oppressions and treacheries to genocides. Way before the Nazi used the image of the white Aryan man versus the dark evil Jew, anti-Semitic racist ideologies have been firmly embedded in Western culture. Think about the transatlantic slave trade, for instance, where about 12 million slaves are estimated to have been sent on a death voyage across the Atlantic to the Americas. What about their history and their stories? Well, all history is the history of the winners, Said argues. You don't hear the narratives of the other, the non-dominant one, the loser, essentially. You just think back to history lessons. Whose perspective did you learn? Did you receive a very much one-sided image of who were the good and who were the bad? Why aren't children taught about the genocides committed by the colonizers across the American continent? The thing is, it's still easier to see the wrongs of others than oneself, especially if oneself is white. So how could white men get away with this? Well, as Said says, it's a power relationship. And in this relationship, the white man holds the power of representation, of creating what is the norm and what is broadcast to the world. And that, very simply put, is white patriarchy. And this mindset was used to in turn march into other countries and enslave people that were seen as inferior, that were on the lower end of the power dichotomy because of their skin color and their gender. So really the system of thinking was then imported and enforced in those conquered territories. And really a lot of the institutions that subsequently have established themselves there have, to a larger or lesser extent, inherited this cultural tradition. So after this short history lesson, here we are in a time where this power dichotomy is still prevalent, but we can feel a change in the air. I'm sure all of you have seen the hashtag #NotAllMen on social, but for anyone who hasn't, this hashtag can usually be found in responses to reports of white men acting in an abusive, racist, sexist, and so on way by people wanting to show that not all white men are evil, raping beasts, which obviously not all men are, but that's not the point here. The reason why this hashtag is problematic is that, first of all, it shifts the focus. It takes it away from the real societal issues that are being discussed to a defensive place of self-justification. And that place is completely unnecessarily. It's very obvious that no one's condemning everyone who's identified as man here. But the hashtag takes away from the issue by focusing on men as the victim of generalization, really, not on women. And that in itself is really super problematic because it moves the discussion away from where it needs to be. Shows how fragile masculinity is. So what this means is normative heteromasculinity, stereotypically, is very fragile. So if you put it under the microscope for even one bit, many can feel directly attacked. And feeling attacked is seen as a form of weakness. And stereotypically, masculinity is associated with strength, not weakness. So hence the need to defend oneself. Again, like I said, that's problematic because the hashtag it's just very selfish and steers away from the real issues. But also, in a way, it cements that stereotypical thinking of what masculinity is. And lastly, I'd like to bring the counter argument, hashtag all men. So with the hashtag not all men, as a man, what you're saying is, I'm not a part of the problem, I treat women well, I'm respectful, I want equity. And while you might want all of these, you are washing your hands of the issues at hand by having this kind of attitude. Because really, if I walk home alone in the dark at night and a man walks behind me, it doesn't really matter what his intentions are at all, because I'm not risking finding out. And that's the truth of the matter. We need to realize that just by being, we are part of a system. So we can't be neutral and we can't be Switzerland about it. And therefore, we need to act accordingly. The Sarah Everard case earlier this year in London, it was a very tragic and horrific case. And it shone a light on a really terrible reality. And that is that despite women being cautious, doing everything right, living in a Western metropolis, still not safe. So the case caused lots of discussions on social media and in politics and across the globe in general. I wanted to share some posts with you today. So really, if you only take one thing away from the session, I hope it's this. Yes, not all men are murderers, but all women feel unsafe because of men, and therefore it's all men's responsibility to get involved and not see this as a feminist issue. So really, what can we do for a safer, more inclusive and equitable world? First of all, what does that mean? A diverse, equitable and inclusive society. I'm sure many of you have seen this image or a similar one before. So I think probably most of you will agree that at the moment we're at the reality stage, meaning power and money to the 1% while children are dying of malnourishment, let alone being in a position to think about a career or going to a baseball game. Next to it, we have equality. Now, equality in the past century has been the buzzword, the state of being to strive for. And while yes, it is an improvement to our reality, in that everyone gets the same, as you can see from the image, it's still not good enough. It still won't make us a truly inclusive and a diverse society. Equity in the last years seems to have replaced the ideal of equality and means that everyone gets the support they need. So thinking practically, as an example, as a Muslim girl in Rwanda, you'll need a lot more support compared to, say, a white, straight American boy to make it to the top of their career, or even to have a career. Equity doesn't necessarily get rid of the system yet, though. It doesn't mean institutionalized racism or sexism, for instance, are completely demolished, which is where justice comes into play. So really, what we all ideally should be aiming for is actually not equity, but justice. So that's where we really ideally want to get to. Now, lots of people have thought about and come up with strategies and changes that we need to make. For this talk, I'd like to look at the framework put into place 2019 from the WHO and UN Women. They published that in collaboration with other organizations, and it's called Respect Women. It's a framework that prevents predominantly violence against women, and it's aimed at policymakers, but it's very applicable for many other areas. I've linked it here, but you can easily find it on the WHO pages. So each letter of respect stands for one of 7 strategies: relationship skills strengthening, empowerment of women, services ensured, poverty reduced, enabling environments, schools, workplaces, public spaces created, child and adolescent abuse prevented, and transformed attitudes, beliefs, and norms. I know not all of those strategies might be applicable to you and to every scenario, but I just wanted to highlight some that I think can be transferred quite easily. The first one is empowering women. This refers to economic and social empowerment, and it includes finances and ownership, but also training interventions, collective action, helping create safe spaces, and mentoring to build skills. These skills can be in many different areas, such as more soft skills like assertiveness, negotiation skills, self-confidence, but also practical training, like in finances or loans. You can either help out yourself by becoming a mentor, or you could build on the work of and support women's organizations. Next, environments made safe. And this is really important. And it's just basically to create safe environments, including workplaces and other public spaces, where women and really any marginalized person is free from the fear and experience of harassment and other forms of violence. I know this is a lot of text here, but there's a couple of things that I just wanted to point out. First, focus on the protective factors, as they call it, and you'll see some actions that you can take away from this. So leadership, decision-making, and advocacy skills for women. I know this is something that is specifically for women, but it's important men support women and even send their female employees onto courses, workshops available that will help with this. Oftentimes, women can feel like they need to play the rules of the game being white patriarchy. Especially in places of work, women might fear to speak out about something because they fear being the opinionated one, or worse. The #MeToo movement is a prime example of where to begin with. Women have kept quiet about abusive behavior for fear of reputational damage and their careers. So this is a task women need to set themselves, to be braver, to advocate, to speak up and not be bystanders. And this is something that needs to be addressed by leadership and people in decision-making positions as well. This process is not just a bottom-up approach. It needs to be a holistic approach through all levels of seniority. It's not just women, though. Men need to be supportive of women, need to help create a better society where actually it's not brave of a woman to speak out, but rather where it would be unheard of that a woman wouldn't. So the issue that needs to be tackled is very clearly victim blaming, bystanderism, the kind of she was asking for it toxic mentality that reaffirms stereotypes and biased thinking. Instead, we need to actively create a culture of speaking out where women who stand their ground aren't labeled as bossy, where women don't need to adapt their personality for fear of upsetting a fragile masculinity. Second, really look at your place of work and the mechanisms it has in place to ensure a safe working environment. Are those sufficient, or are those actually only tick boxes put into place? What happens if anything is reported? What's the reporting process like? Will anyone reporting an incident need to jump through 1,000 bureaucratic hoops? And even worse, will that person be being affected, be slut-shamed, blamed? It's so important that these situations are handled well. So these are more actual policies, but also look at the work culture. For instance, are women included in projects? What tasks are they assigned to? But also, are women included in social activities? And are those activities inclusive to begin with? Will a woman feel safe and comfortable joining in? Or will she be in that hard place of being uncomfortable to join in, but also too afraid to decline for fear of being passed over at the next chance of a promotion, for instance? The last strategy that is applicable to us and that we can easily change without being politicians ourselves is transformed attitudes, beliefs, and norms. Very simply put, this strategy aims to promote positive attitudes, beliefs, and norms that promote gender equality, that challenge male power and privilege, discrimination, and female subordination, and that really condemn violence or harassment. The idea here is that these beliefs and norms listed on the left go hand in hand and they strengthen violence. So if we start breaking down even one, this will have a ripple effect on the others. So if we start breaking down biases and stereotypes of masculinity, femininity, of what men and women should do, look like, how they should act, then we already influence how gender roles are viewed, and so on. Importantly, for this, we need to self-reflect and critically think about our own actions. Instead of focusing on how great and supportive we already are, learn how our behavior could possibly still be a part of the problem. What I mean here is, you might still be doing things that others perceive as threatening. To give you an example, if you get off a bus at night at the same time as a woman, how do you act? Do you walk behind her? Do you swiftly move past her and walk ahead at a distance? Do you change the side of the street? While you might not notice, you could be perceived as a predator to her, as a threat. So do everything you can to remove yourself and make yourself perceived less harmful. So really self-analyze your actions and break with unconscious habits. To summarize all these points, first of all, help women's empowerment. So think back to the graphic about equality, equity, and justice. While some women might be able to get what they need themselves, some might need more support for various different reasons. Even if you can't actively help, at least ensure that you're not a hurdle. I've said marginalized people play by the rules of the game, but clearly the rules have very blatantly only benefited a certain type of human, which is privilege, and it's really unacceptable. So clearly we need to change the rules. When we ask ourselves, why isn't there a woman of color on our executive board, for instance, we need to remember that women of color play a much harder and different game, have potentially a lot more obstacles thrown their way. And only when we start removing those obstacles for the different marginalized groups, and yes, those obstacles can be different for the different groups, and only then can we actually achieve an equitable, diverse, and inclusive society. Second, reflect on your and others' behavior. Really simply put, only when you know about it can you actively change it. And even the slightest change can already mean safety for someone. I know progress will be slow, but if we all do our bit to chip away at white patriarchy and its institutionalized representation, together we can make a difference. And really lastly, I know I've talked a lot about women here, but think about intersecting forms of discrimination. So based on race, gender, class, ethnicity, disability, sexual orientation, gender identity, just to name a couple. So thank you very much for your attention. If you'd like to continue the discussion, here's my contact details, and I'll be happy to take any questions or any comments if there are any.